Cool, you were
Very
good to
good.
go.
Awesome. I invited Andrew because he's got a lot of experience with cacti medicine,
Uh-huh.
and that's a main part of the foundation you work with, right? Is or the
Well,
Limina Foundation is.
yeah, Limina Foundation, and it comes from the word liminal, the liminal phase of initiation, which is that betwixt and between place in a rite of passage or in a process of initiation, where the old is falling away, but the new has not totally revealed itself to you. So it's the place where transformation actually takes place in any kind of proper initiation around the world. So it's like the main body of the initiatory, experience. And the word liminal is that word, and unfortunately it was used in so many places that we couldn't quite have that word as our foundation, so we just used the word limina instead, to still draw that in. The cactus and the peyote are certainly a part of what we're interested in, and we're the overarching, I think, interest of the foundation is about transformation, initiation, consciousness, the expansion of consciousness, rites of passage, and how that will impact us as human beings and culture at large. So
Awesome. Just had a question pop up. So let's start with introductions, since we just kind of jumped in.
yeah.
Introduce yourself to everybody, Adele,
Yeah.
and
Well,
tell.
okay. Well, first, thank you, Desmond, for initiating this and contacting me, and having me do this. My name is Adele Getty, and I'm the director of Limina Foundation with my husband, Michael Williams, and we're a fairly new nonprofit. We're a couple of years old. We've had some good fortune to have some benefactors, which has allowed us to help in small ways a number of people and groups, and including preservation of peyote, in particular. I've been a writer in the course of my life. I wrote a book called an art book on the divine feminine, called Goddess, Mother of Living Nature. And then I also did a book called A Sense of the Sacred, where I looked at ceremony cross-culturally and more or less deconstructed the content, the cultural content, but looked at what the actual structures of ceremony and how it shows up in any kind of given ceremony, so that modern people might be able to find ways to create meaningful ceremonies and initiation process for themselves without having to go into another culture.
Yeah, I saw a YouTube video you did, and you kind of delved into that a little bit. It was a very good story. Can you kind of give a condensed kind of introduction to that kind of process? Because it's, very, it gets a very sensitive area sometimes when, kind of, when white people, kind of appropriate indigenous cultures and everything. And I've listening to your discussion on that video, you seem very sensitive, very attuned to this issue. And I think, the way that you handled it is a very forward thinking, I guess. So can you
Oh,
kind of delve into that?
yeah, thank you. Thank you for watching that and appreciating it. Yeah, I think that all too often, because as a culture, modern white people, let's just say white people or white people, people who identify in that way, whether they're Americans or Europeans, um, all too often they uh, find themselves kind of immersing themselves in another culture, whether they're being Buddhists, Tibetans, or they're being Hindus, or they're being you know Native Americans, or an African culture, whatever it might be. And what I noticed, early on in my life, and I did a little bit of graduate work in anthropology, and it was that uh, you know we will never be able to be that culture. We will never be a Native American. We will never be a Huichol Indian. We will never be a Mazatec, or a Iowas, a Yanomami or a Shipibo or whatever, it might, or a Tibetan as far as that goes, or a Hindu. And so, where does that leave us as a culture? Because we don't really have meaningful ceremonies and initiations in our culture, which is a huge, it's a tragic event. And um, Joseph Campbell once said, if you want to see the impact of the lack of proper initiation, read the headlines of the newspapers. um, it- you know, and so it's like, these initiatory rites that can be so important in these traditional cultures, the absence of them in our culture. We get a driver's license at 16, or we get to drink at 21. We've all get drink before we're 21, of course, but you know, they're just kind of meaningless. There's no real change in status, even if it's a bar mitzvah or a confirmation or what it might be. So I just became very interested in, how we might, um, be able to learn. And I think it's a process that kind of circumvents then the idea of appropriating another culture's culture. If we can begin to find our own way into a way to make sacred, initiate our children into something meaningful, create meaningful rites of passage for them, and maybe somewhere several generations down the line we'll actually see some kind of tradition happening, in our own communities at large.
Yeah, what you just said really resonates with the current state of events. If Andrew goes looks outside his door, there'll be people outside protesting on the Capitol, building. So it's been the tragic outcome of all this right now is just
Yeah,
this civil unrest.
right. And I think even this protesting that's happening, because I came of age in the I graduated high school in 1967, the year of the Summer of Love. I was very intrigued by all of that from my little small town. It was very foreign to everything that I had been taught. But, the Vietnam War was part of that. And I have to say that going to Washington, D.C., and finding myself in a situation where the protests began to, turn violent, and uh, watching, uh, you know, police in riot gear and tear gas canisters shooting across the Washington Monument. That was an initiation for me. I just remember turning around and looking at that as an 18-year-old and being just stunned, because it was not what I had been taught in civics class, that we had this right to protest, and that, this was the First Amendment, and this was, you know, the First Amendment, not the 28th Amendment, but the primary First Amendment to be able to question our government. So I feel like there's a whole generation of people who are going through a really big initiation right now.
That's a good way of framing that. What's it like now, seeing all this bubble up again, all these years
Um,
later?
I think it's fantastic. I think I I you know I saw provocateurs when the Vietnam War was happening and free speech was happening, um, and I know what that's like. And I know what it's like to be there peacefully protesting. And I had trained in nonviolent protest, and I it's a very effective way of de-escalating, whoever and whatever might be, whether it's a provocateur from the government or the police or white supremacists, or whoever it might be. And then of course there's just the kind of crazy people who just want to loot and do that too, but the vast majority of people are really there, and I think experiencing something really, really powerful. And unfortunately it's a time of this virus where we've been social distancing, and suddenly we're tens of thousands of people strong in the streets. So um, it must be worth it.
Yeah, I guess they say that racism is a public health hazard too, and you kind of have to weigh the two.
I agree. That's what I mean. It's obviously worth it, to stand up to this, and for white people to stand in solidarity with this movement is really, really important.
Andrew and I were back out there a couple weeks ago, and we've been kind of joking amongst ourselves, like, this must feel like it was about in the 60s. Here we are in Denver with decriminalized psilocybin and at a protest, like, it's like just repeating itself. So, I think there's the kind of the parallels between 67 and 2020 are strong in a
Yeah,
lot of regards.
yeah, yeah.
So can you share with us your introduction into the realm of psychedelia and what kind of gotten you to this path to forming the Limina Foundation?
Yeah, sure. Well, you know, coming of age in the 60s, it was, part of the culture at large. I was maybe more cautious than most, but I also was, I think, very lucky in that the people who both introduced me to marijuana and to LSD, um, they did it in a really beautiful, uh, I wouldn't say ceremonial way, but in a very conscious way. So my first psychedelic experience, I spent a number of months being in the company of people tripping, uh, before I decided that I wanted to do it. And so when I did do it, I had friends that were a little bit older, and they had me in their house, and they had art paper and books and that kind of thing, and they um, really did present it as a very special moment, and that it would change my life forever. And there was a number of expectations, and I had like perhaps maybe like the classic perfect first LSD experience on a barrel of orange sunshine, and uh, and I was taken outside and into nature, and was invited to hug a tree and to, just experience all of that. And it was very powerful, besides the beauty, the mystical. Definitely had a kind of classical mystical experience of experiencing love and connection and feeling one with everything, and you know unable to really describe it. This ineffable quality, to the psychedelic experience. But I also, had a number of psychological revelations around myself, my childhood, my relationship with my parents, um, and I felt like I to use Aldous Huxley, it was like I cleansed the doors of perception in some way. Um, I didn't come out of it, a perfect person, or, um, 100% psychologically sound, or, perfect in that way. But I cleared up a lot of uh, uh, what felt like family baggage, um, trauma, those kinds of things that later on I could say that, um, uh, if I wouldn't have had a psychedelic, I don't know that I would have lived much into my 30s. That's how extreme it was for me. In that, the psychedelic experience really allowed me to come more fully into myself and make decisions that would like forever change the course of my life. And after that first experience, I was young. I didn't know where my life was going, what I would be when I grew up. But I felt like, you know, I've after that first experience, I said to my friends, I want to do this every year of my life. And if there's ever a year that I do this and I don't like myself, I will then I will change the direction that I'm going in. And so that was the impact of my initial contact with LSD.
It's interesting that, you say that, you've kind of like, I need to do this on a yearly basis. That kind of that beginning of, I need some kind of ritual,
Yeah,
into my life. And, that's kind of that first experience kind of opened that door to this kind of this interest you've had in ritual and, traditions.
yes.
Um, jumped out at my ear. Um, so you had this experience at a young age, and you know, get kind of this ritual game plan started in your brain. Like, I need to try this a year, try to work on myself and, try to help become a better person. You've kind of intuitively,
Right.
you know, knew that. And, like my first experience with psychedelics, I didn't know that this was like a spiritual, endeavor. That was kind
Uh-huh.
of something that kind of revealed itself, to myself afterwards. I was like, oh wow, this, like I had some, graduate work under my belt at that time, and it's kind of helped to kind of click everything in my head that I've learned in graduate school. I'm like, oh, that makes sense now. I can kind of emotionally allow myself to, connect those dots in my head. So, but this kind of got you on the path, right, to where you
Well,
are now.
yeah, it wasn't very conscious, at that point. It certainly wasn't, conscious. But like you said, I had my first philosophy class prior to that experience, psychedelic experience, and I didn't get it. I did
Mhm.
not get what was being talked about. But when I was on the medicine, I completely got it. And
Uh-huh.
you know, the whole existential dilemma of it all, and uh, the meaning of life, and all of those things, and then you know later in my life, in the late 70s, early 80s, I had another nonprofit called Medicine Ways, um, that didn't didn't really have anything to do with psychedelics because it was so illegal, at that point. But it was about connecting people, to the earth, and to ideas of, back then, in the 70s, the bumper sticker, "The Earth is our mother." That was a novel idea. Um, that wasn't something that everybody had thought of prior to that. And so, that it, that way of getting people to begin to have some kind of deep ecology view of our relationship to the planet and to the environment was really important. Um, and I had worked with Stephen Foster at Rites of Passage and Meredith Little, and I was the training coordinator. So I had been taking people out on 3 day, 3 night, vision quest work, where we would, work with them in a ceremonial way. And we did have native teachers who were helping us, in that process. And they were rogue. I can look back and I realize, they were really kind of rogue teachers, in the sense that they recognize the need for white people to get connected into the environment, and particularly, I think, those of us in the United States, because we, as a culture, we don't have much of a sense of place, because we don't feel like we're from here. And it's like, how do we begin to sink our roots in here, like an exotic, we're an exotic species on Turtle Island. But how long do we be an exotic species? Like, when is the moment when we start to feel ourselves actually become native to this land, even though we might be 1 or 2 or 3, 4 generations here? I believe that if we had that feeling, we could not be destroying the environment the way that we are as a culture.
Yeah, and what you said just kind of sparked that thought in my head. In graduate school, I worked on the American Indian enculturation skill. And, enculturation is different from acculturation. Acculturation is how are you transitioning into the mainstream culture,
Uh-huh.
as a American Indian, and versus enculturation, which is how you practice your traditional beliefs, your medicine, Indian medicine, talking with elders, attending Indian church. And, I think that's part of it, that, we have these situations, and there's something called bicultural stress. So it's like, when you're at home, you practice your culture, but when you're in school with your white friends, you got to be white, and try to fit into that regard, as well. And it
Right.
becomes a very, we use the term integration all the time in psychedelic work, but that's the type of integration too. How are you integrating these two aspects of yourselves? The, you know, the the when you're with the mainstream culture, or versus when you're at your culture at home. And I think there's people, people from different backgrounds struggle with that in different regards. Like you said earlier, that sometimes you go to synagogue and you go undergo a bar mitzvah, and you're really strong in that tradition, but that might not be that's not the mainstream culture of America, and that causes stress for people when they're trying to navigate those two identities at that same time. And there isn't an overarching American tradition, an overarching American, framework for culture, right?
Right. Yeah. And I think part of that is involved with really not, we're such a mobile people. Um, we move hundreds and thousands of miles away from our family of origin. Um, and it's like, how do we develop a sense of place? How do we really get rooted, in the land? How do we, connect with and honor the ancestors, who have come before? How do we acknowledge the native tribes who have inhabited the place where we might be living, at the moment? And how do we make that part of what we pass on to our children, of acknowledging that and recognizing that, and understanding how the seasonals, I'm looking out the window at my place here, but just how the seasonal, cycles work, and who were the native peoples. I know that whenever I go anywhere and I do work or workshops, with people or with groups of people, I always try to discover as much as I can about who were the original inhabitants of this land, what was their culture, what were their stories, and how to ask permission, to be there. And if I'm going to pray or do any kind of, ceremony in that place, I feel like it's really important to do that in a respectful way, of where, I'm asking permission to be there, and I'm honoring what has come before. And it's a particular mindset that I think more and more people are cultivating that. And I think in the realm of psychedelics and psychedelics ceremonial work, people are understanding that there are basics that are universal, and that we're kind of like children at this point. The white culture, we don't really know, what we're doing, but there's an impulse to want to find our way into a sacred way of being. And the medicine certainly, opens us up to nature, and to the spirit of place and the sense of place.
So kind of, let's get into the indigenous medicine. Like, what was your introduction into this realm, getting permission and to, be a participant? What was that like? And what are your foundation, like what medicines are you working towards preserving, and kind of give us like a status of what they are and how endangered are they?
Early on, I guess in the 70s, I had the opportunity to connect with the Huichol Indians in Mexico, and particularly with Don Jose Matsua, who was a Maracame, with his people, which would be like, not just a medicine man. he may be the only true shaman I've ever met, or whatever even that word is, you know. But he was um, a, a real functioning member of his village. He was quite old. He was about almost 100 years old at that point. He still grew his corn. His role as the curandera shaman Maracame is the Huichol word for that. Um, it's a part-time position, you know. He still had to grow his corn. He still had to participate. He was not being supported by his people like a priest, you know, or uh, you know, is like really real in that way. And he was a healer. And and at the same time, I started to connect with people in the Native American church. So I was having the opportunity to, like, you know, sit with the Native American church, and also you know, be with in the Huichol way, and they're very, very different. But, you know, through that, I really had, I, I, I developed a real respect for the peyote cactus, and for that, you know, particular substance. Although, you know, I'm not limited, you know, to that. At a later later in my life, I also met Reuben Snake, who was a very spiritual man, and he was the president of the NAC. And he's passed on now, but I know that he's viewed as a real, like, a saint or a spiritual teacher. And you know, I asked him at a certain point, I said, you know, so what do we do as white people? You know, how do we begin to kind of retribalize our minds? You know, how do we begin to um, have that experience of um, deep relationships, not only with our place, but with an extended community, because we're so fractured as a people. Um, and he, you know, he said, well, the first thing you have to do is you have to get your songs together. Um, and you know, and I thought that was really beautiful, because it was definitely in line with what we were doing, over the years of, like, um, you know, having these simple songs about the earth and the nature and great the spirit, and creating songs that have kind of traveled around the world and have, you know, gone into other languages and whatnot. Um, and you know, we know these songs. When there's a big gathering, people sing a song, and, like, how does everybody know that little chant, you know? And that's, I think, part of that process, part of what you know, Reuben was talking about. So, you know, later, more recently, we've been able to support the Niarica Institute. We've supported Susan Valdez with the Huichols, with peyote, you know, preservation, and also Huichol, you know, helping the Huichols. I think the Huichols are doing okay, you know, as a culture. They've never been missionized, really. Um, they live very, you know, on the poverty level, but they live richly, you know, on some level too. And we've also helped with the River Styx and the project in Texas of having a large tract of land where the uh, the peyote for the NAC, you know, can be there. And I think, you know, all these matter. It's it's just such a complicated thing, you know, these medicines, the indigenous peoples involved with them, psychedelic tourism. Um, there's so many positive and negative aspects to all of it.
The NAC is Native American Church. And she's using this acronym and just to make sure, you know, people watching can follow.
Okay,
Uh,
yeah,
and, you know, we had Carlos Pazzola on not too long ago, and he's, you know, the founder of Decriminalize Nature, you know, the first, you know, he spearheaded
yeah,
the initiative in Oakland, right?
yeah,
And, you know, he had peyote in on his, you know, initiative, and they had to go back in and remove that, you know, at the request of the NAC because it's endangered, right? And it's, you know, its status is kind of fragile right now because, like you
yeah.
said, it's kind of a trendy thing for people with means to go and try to, you know, utilize this medicine, and you know, and it's at that point of almost being extinct, right?
Well, I don't. There is a lot of peyote in Mexico,
Hmm.
um, and I think in terms of um, uh, you know, I think that if I understand right, the Native American church at this point is about 500,000 members strong, and um, if you think if on any given Saturday night, all of those chapters are using peyote, it's not sustainable. Um, if they, you know, there have been movements to make alliances with the Huichols and to try to have them be able to have peyote from you know, from the desert in Mexico, but that could be a real threat as well. And so I like what the project in Texas is doing in well, one, the government should allow the Native American church to cultivate it, not just have to buy it from licensed dealers. Um, there needs to be a way for Native American church to make themselves, I think, become, you know, sustainable, you know, with the peyote. And one of the things is that they're now able to like send seeds back to Texas, so that the seeds can be cultivated. You know, if they get peyote cactus and their seeds in the plant. So there's these small steps of like how to make it sustainable, and I I don't think I know that there's white people who go and pick peyote and do that, but peyote is a very um, you know, it's not the kind of plant where you have 6 large buttons of peyote and you just eat them in a matter of minutes and wait for something to happen. You know, it's not that kind of process. It's a process that you eat it over many hours, and so it takes some stamina and you know, a willingness that often our culture, you know, that wants just an immediate thing. You get it, you eat it, you take it, you drop it, and come on in a few minutes, and you're high, and you have an experience. Peyote doesn't really work like that. Yeah, so it may be a saving grace for that particular cactus.
Yeah, you know, it's the we're an instant gratification culture for sure.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
What was your how did your first experience with peyote contrast with your first LSD experience? What were the two? What was the main
Uh,
takeaway?
it was my first peyote experience was in a very structured all night ceremony. Um, and eating the peyote and drinking peyote tea over a course of, of 12 hours. And it was a singing prayer, the ceremony. And so it was very, revelatory, and um, uh, um, uh, I felt like I connected to spirit in a way that had just been a metaphor for me in my life in the past. um, and I found myself, actually in the experience of feeling very, opened and connected and able to. Uh, I could feel the spirit moving through me, which was quite, like I said, up until then, all of ideas around that was just a metaphor. Um, and so, I think with the psychedelics in general, they often move us out of those the rhetorical and the metaphorical into the actual direct experience of that much deeper connection with something other than ourselves.
It's a good point. So what was the aha moment when you're like, oh my gosh, like this is a scarce resource that needs to be preserved? You started a foundation. What was that kind of what happened to get you to this point?
Well, actually, um, my husband was the one who wanted to resurrect the old medicine ways foundation, and so I was like, okay, go ahead. you know, I felt like, well, I kind of did that several decades ago, and I'm not so sure, but go ahead. And so he did, and then the next thing that happened was we had a couple of benefactors who showed up, and patrons who gave us some money to actually allow us to do something. And Michael likes to say, we have the shamanic business plan, that that we don't really know what we're doing, but the spirit is revealing it to us as we're going along. Like, most people would be out there fundraising and doing this and that and getting their name out there, and we've just been pretty low key with it, and moving in a way that of when something connects with us personally. It's not like we take applications, or we don't have, it's not all that much money, but we're not, people don't apply to us, or there's no formal application. But when we feel like there's something that we would like to contribute to, we do. And so the first thing we did, let me tell you, the first thing we did as we got our status of 501(c), I said, well, what I think we should do, and this was before we had any money, I said, let's practice the giveaway. So let's do a fundraiser for Niarica Institute, which is an institute in Mexico that works with rehabilitation, with the Huichols, with peyote conservation, drug policy, all these things that we like, and we love the people who run the organization. And so I said, let's do a retreat for them, and we'll generate money, and we'll give them money, and that will be how we'll initiate, that will be our initiation with Limina Foundation to do a giveaway. So we raised $30,000 for them, which for us was a substantial amount of money, and it was wonderful, that we got to do that and support them. And wasn't about a month or so later, we met a couple, and we did some kind of therapy work with them, and they didn't know about what we had just done with Niarika, but they turned around and they gave us $30,000.
Wow.
And so,
yeah. I had a
this,
professor in grad school. His catchphrase was "trust the process." If you just go in and you just kind of,
well,
sometimes as a therapist, you're just kind of, I don't know what's going on. But, if you just trust the process to unfold, things happen. Keep
yeah.
going.
Well, this was the beginning of the shamanic business plan. Of like, there's an energetic of magic that if we don't try to control it or manipulate it or get too aggressive with it, it will evolve, naturally. So so we definitely have, the Weechels have been, part of our focus. Peyote has been part of our focus. We've also supported CIIS, the California Institute of Integral Studies, around a grant to help with the FDA to allow them to have expanded access in their program, where the students might be able to have a one-off administration of, like, I would administer MDMA to you, and then you would administer MDMA to me at another point, and we'd have the opportunity to practice, what that therapy might be like. So we were able to help, with that. And, there's been different things in different indigenous elders who have just needed help with medical bills, and so we just kind of move in whatever kind of touches our heart, really. We did a psychedelic survey last year, a cultural survey. It was not an academic survey. And we're just in the process of analyzing the qualitative results, and we're actually looking for somebody who can look at the quantitative results that we had.
I get those letters PhD after my name. That is kind of in my realm. So
Well,
just
we should talk.
if you,
We should talk afterwards. So
yeah.
we have somebody. He's looking at it, and we want to publish. We had a lot of comment boxes, and so he's dealing with all of those. And on an average, anytime there was a comment box, we had anywhere from 100 to 200 comments. Psychedelic people really like to talk about their experiences, and the survey, like I said, it wasn't an academic survey. We asked a lot of questions that would never get asked, I think, in an academic survey.
Mm-hmm.
But we will publish it. We'll do a peer-reviewed journal article, with the results. But I think even more interesting will be more of the mass media little articles that could come out of it, and just like looking through it, it's pretty interesting. I was surprised by some of the answers that we got, and so that's a project and recently we were working on also how to have an association, a professional association for psychedelic therapists, and a licensing board. Um, and we were going to help with the fundraising around that. And we've helped a little bit. We've paid a salary for just an admin person, but I think we're kind of backing out of that because some bigger players have come into that, and that seems like an essential thing that should happen, in the psychedelic community at large.
I know that's a good point that in the indigenous tradition and cultures that there's a medicine person, and you go and you they administer the mushrooms or the cacti or whatever, and you have this experience, and they're the ones that guide you through it. And kind of in the American equivalent of that is your therapist. It's someone that's kind of esteemed within the community that you go to and you talk to. And how do we integrate psychedelics into that experience? Because I know there's a big issue right now with since it's all underground, that people going, especially women, being vulnerable to sexual assault, that type of stuff. And you can't really report it to anybody because there is no licensing board. This is all underground. And what do you mean you're doing, illegal narcotics with someone, la la. So you open yourself up to that,
Yeah.
scrutiny as well.
And there's a lot
Um,
of bad actors now. I think over all these decades, eh, when it was still very much more taboo, it's lost its taboo at this point, even though it's still illegal with I think the population at large, because they read, all of the research studies around depression and anxiety and, PTSD and whatnot, and there's such a need in the population at large to alleviate the suffering in some way. So there's a feeling like it's already happened, but it hasn't. And
yeah,
what I've seen is that a lot of um, unskilled, untrained people have jumped into the psychedelic. I see it like a psychedelic parade is now going down the boulevard, and there's all this like juggling for positions and trying to get in front of the parade that has actually been happening for a very, very long time in a very controlled and relatively safe way. And um, I see people get up at conferences and at really good conferences and announce, I do mushroom ceremonies and they're legal, and come to my, in Mexico or in, Jamaica or whatever. They are not legal in Mexico or in Jamaica. They might turn a blind eye, but no, it's not legal. And people are very naive, can be very naive. Uh, and then of course there's, predators and just, bad actors that are also engaged. And that's where this professional association and a licensing board could be really interesting, especially if they found ways to allow skilled people from the underground to be part of it, and allowed indigenous curanderas and maracames and other, ayahuasqueros people, because they don't have a PhD and they're not a licensed therapist, but my God, they have, um, you know, thousands of years behind them, of culture. They know about the medicine. And so I hope in those future days that we're talking about that those people as well will be able to be part of the um, the above ground and the a professional association to be able to work in the field.
yeah. We use the term like indigenous medicine, and people's mind goes to mushrooms or peyote or San Pedro or some kind of mescaline, yielding cacti. And my friend Glenna Stumbling Bear, who's a psychologist, Kiowa, she was supporting a fellow native's GoFundMe page a couple of months ago for hoop skirts, and she made the comment that really stood out to me. This is part of our culture, and our culture is our medicine. So you kind of have to think about medicine broader, outside of, something that you ingest. There's medicine and tradition.
Right.
And in that regard too, that, you can't really, people say I sit with the medicine, and they're talking about, I took some mushrooms or I took San
Right.
Pedro. They're not talking about, like you said, going into this all night ceremony where there's like these rituals and these songs that are going on. The song is the medicine, the clothing's the medicine, the
Right.
elders in the room are the medicine. So this is a
Yes.
very, broader conversation about how do we preserve these things, and how do we bring these experts in who've learned, kind of like a trade from, their elders, who learned it from their
Yes.
elders, from their elders. And how do we help give them space in this psychedelic revolution or renaissance, and having them a part of these processes and licensing boards, and and at the same time understanding the historical trauma of acculturation and genocide that's gone on, and making this a safe place for them to share their wisdom, with these professionals who, we have a lot of healing going on that needs to go on, as we can see in our streets right now.
Right.
you know Psychedelics could really open the door for a lot of, and there's research out there that, ayahuasca with epigenetic trauma, trauma that's stored in your genes, and that stuff that gets passed on.
Right.
So I wanted to make sure, we illuminate that there's, not only the plant medicine, but there's also the medicine of culture, that needs to be
Yes.
preserved.
Yes. And I think, it reminds me of, the original nonprofit that we had that was called Medicine Ways didn't have anything to do with psychedelics. It was like the medicine of the earth, and it was a way to teach people a certain kind of respect, for the land and for where they live and their sense of place, and how to make medicine, how to make medicine in their life, how to get, how to, you know, medicine objects, we think of that as, native people everywhere, have their medicine objects. And people, inherently, we go to the beach, we pick up a rock, we bring the rock home, we put it on our shelf. Why are we doing that? We're doing it because somehow we felt a connection, and that becomes part of our medicine, and we make an altar in our home, and we gather things, and we put things there. And I think that kind of, process for contemporary people is really important. I, I did some work about a year ago with somebody who does coaching. He's a coach. He works with CEOs and whatnot. And so I was talking about a family altar. And when you go home, people, you could think about with your family of making a sacred space in your house. And so he called me about a week afterwards, and he said, I went home and I told my kids and wife, what do you think? Should we I'd like to like make an altar like together where everybody brings something, and in times of need or in times of celebration, it's a place where we can go and we can talk in a different way, and communicate in a sacred way with one another and hear and listen. And he said, his kids and family were like, "What took you so long, Dad? Let's do this." They were like very excited to think about, bringing that idea of the sacred, into their home and into their family in a way that will continue probably for the rest of their lives with one another.
Yeah, that's an interesting, story that, a friend was just telling me the other day. He was at this, you know, Colorado's pretty hippy dippy in some
Yeah,
pockets, and
yeah.
he was at some place. He bought like stone, and as at the cash register buying it, they smudged it with sage, as they were giving it, and I just like laughed. I was like, oh, that's classic Colorado, kind of mentality.
I know.
And but it is a tradition,
Well, back, it's so funny because like back in that 30 years ago, 40 years ago, medicine ways, it was like, okay, I mean, you go out and you pick your herbs or you pick sage, you ask permission, you make an offering to the plant, you make your sage bundle, da, da, da. And at that time, it's like, what people were like, what smudge, what is that? And now it's like, you go to the store and you buy a smudge stick, or
yeah.
they smudge it for you, before you take it home. It's a little, it's a, I don't want to judge it, but
Yeah.
I,
I'll judge it. No, it's funny. Uh, and it took me a minute to get my mind around it too. I did my pre-doctoral internship up in Standing Rock in North Dakota at Fort Yates. So, and the year I did my internship, it was the first year that they were in this new building, and this building had some negative emotional history attached to it. So of course, the first thing first day there, we're smudging this building, getting rid of, all the bad energy or whatever. And and I was like, there was nothing about this, in my, you know, all my academic training, up to this moment. But here I am, and learning to respect that and to understand that it's traditional, but you're writing a narrative in your brain and helping to the healing that needs to go on. When you had that go in with that mindset that things need to be healed, and you go through these traditions and everything, like we said, it's the culture that's the healing. It might not be the smell, the smudge per se, but it's the ritual, of doing the event. So
right.
you gotta have to respect that, I guess, on some level. But you know the scientist academic part of myself kind of giggles, but the like I said, that bicultural stress, but the native side of me is like, oh yeah, yeah, I get it.
Right.
uh and uh so you know being a native psychologist, I'm really big into storytelling, and we always tell our stories, and that was one of my interests in bringing you here. Was I want to hear Adele's story. She's got a really cool story, and I want to share it with people. And that's often feedback we get as natives, is that you guys don't shut up. You go on and you go on, about everything that brought you here to this moment. And I feel like I've kind of done that with the audience, so far. So I want to kind of get more of the meat and potatoes of peyote. Like, what's the, because I know there's some really diehard people watching right now. Like, what's the status of peyote? How can we help preserve this? Like how long does it take to grow and cultivate? You kind of give those types of feedback and information for people who really need that information or want that information, so they can take that and go out and build upon it and do their own work and help support this cause?
So you're asking specifically about the cactus itself and growing of it, and that, that kind of thing. It's a very slow growing cactus. Um, it uh, it's it 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 grows, in the desert, but it grows in the shade of bushes. So it does not like to be exposed to a lot of direct sunlight. A lot of people, if they end up with, a few little, peyote, buttons, they, can overwater them for one thing, or they can, leave them, leave them, put them in the sun because they think it's a desert, it's a desert plant, so it's going to want a lot of sun, but they don't. They like really filtered light, um, and the status of it it's an interesting plant because it's the only plant that's kind of racially divided, in the sense of Native Americans can use it and have it, and it's legal, but other people cannot. Um, and like I'm not really allowed to, you know, have or ingest peyote, at least in the United States. In Mexico, I can, if I'm, with the Huichols. And when you go on the peyote hunt with the Huichols, that, they live hundreds of miles away from where the peyote grows. So you go there, and they have a legal card letter that allows them and you to transport the peyote back to the village, to where they are. Um, and but for you know people in the United States or Native American church members who, have peyote, yeah, they should take care of it by not putting it directly in the sun, or maybe just, early morning sunlight is fine. But you'll see it will get scorched, it can get burnt, really easily. It flowers, it makes a beautiful pink flower that's about that high. Um, it And if you take a little paintbrush, if you have a little peyote family, and you take a little like watercolor brush when it's flowering, you can pollinate it from plant to plant, and it makes the tiniest little seeds, little, like almost like a poppy seed, very tiny little black seeds. It's quite hard to cultivate. It's not impossible, but if you're a gardener and you have the patience and the wherewithal to, sprout those seeds, then that is a possibility. A lot of people make a mistake in the way that they cut it, that or they pull it out by the roots, which should never, dig it up. You use a sharp knife and you cut it just, above the surface of a little bit above the surface of the dirt, and that cut, and then have the peyote button, and where you've cut it, it will be all green and wet and, moist, but it'll very soon, like, close over with a crust, and it will keep growing, and then it will sprout little baby peyotes around it. And uh, so you know by actually cutting it properly, you can go from having one button, which you've now cut, to several buttons that will grow back from it. But it takes years for a peyote button to grow, and once they start, then they definitely grow, every year. But um, to get a large peyote, takes 10 years.
So you do the one cut, and then about 8 to 10 years later, you'll have another set of buttons ready to be harvested.
Yeah,
Right?
yeah, yeah. You'll have multiple, and just even having like, a couple of peyote in a little pot, and like I said, when they're flowering, if you just take a brush and go into the flowers, around, you'll pollinate them, and they'll make babies and make little clusters. They're family, they're a family oriented plant. They like clustering together, and um, little peyote families. It's a beautiful plant, beautiful cactus.
So like one button, like set for, like good for one person, several people, like for a ceremony. Like how much does that translate
Well,
into medicine?
if you if you really want to have, I think, the full peyote experience, you really want to eat at least, like 4 to 6 good sized buttons. Um, yeah. Uh, but like I said, you don't just sit down and eat them
Mhm.
like the way people eat psilocybin mushrooms. You have like your, whatever, 4 grams of mushrooms, and you just eat them in a matter of minutes, and you wait for the experience. With peyote, it's such a wonderful ceremonial, um, you know, plant that uh, you have to be committed, time wise, to like. Plus, if you do eat it all really fast like that, you definitely will get sick. And you know, oh, and the other thing, a lot of people think that there's little tufts, little like fuzzy, almost like what you see in an artichoke. There's little tufts in the cactus, and there's always been this myth that that's like strychnine, and it's poison, and it's not, but it is a stomach irritant. So, if you have a decent sized peyote button, say this big, it might have 4 or 6 of these little tufts, on it. And so you just want to take a sharp little paring knife and take those little tufts out. Um, and then you can, cut the cactus and just find a way to, eat it, begin eating it. Um, and, and the Huichos and Native American church too, they often dry it. They'll dry the peyote buttons, and they turn into these like little hard brown. They go from being like nice plump fat little peyote buttons to these like thin little discs almost, and the center is taken out where the tufts are too, and then they'll grind those into a powder, and for some people they find that an easy way to ingest it, or you make kind of like a chew, like a tobacco chew, and can keep it in your cheek, at least in the NAC, in some of the meetings like that, people do that. And the other thing is that you can make a tea out of it. And if you make a tea, I always say, don't boil it. There's just something about, I mean, a slow cooker is a really good way to, I think, make tea, and cook it for, the better part of a day, 12 hours or something like that. Just let it, keep cooking in a slow cooker or a crock pot. And you can make it as strong as you like, and that's a really nice way to ingest it too, and to just drink it slowly. Yeah.
What's it taste like?
It, it depends who you talk to, you know. And it depends. I think it depends on how the peyote has been treated and how it's been harvested. And I have found, like with the Huichols, because it's such a ceremony for them. Everything is, they before they go to gather it, they have to go and kill a deer. They, there, it's a long ceremonial process. They have to go to a number of sacred sites along the way and make offerings and come into relationship with, what they're doing. And, and then they finally get around to going to where the peyote is growing, and then going out and harvest and finding it. Everybody goes out and gather, cuts peyote as they find it. And so I find when that whole process is done, that peyote in particular always tastes sweet. I mean, not sweet like candy, but not bitter. Um, and there's other times that you can taste peyote, or somebody has peyote, or you're offered peyote, and it can taste really really bitter. The other interesting thing is peyote doesn't really like alcohol. um, and if somebody has a lot of alcohol in their system, even though they may not have drunk that day, consumed any alcohol, peyote definitely can make them sick, and make them reevaluate their alcohol use. And I think in Native American church, it's been really helpful with alcoholism, among the different people, and plus it's such a spiritual experience in the Native American church ceremony, of um, uh, that all night commitment of being there, and um, the beauty, I think, of you know I've been in Native American church ceremonies where there's been Arapaho and Navajo and Pueblo Indians, and Cheyenne and Crow, and uh, it's a it, it's very beautiful because they get to sing in the spirit language together, and so it's such a unifying experience for for the Native American, I think, to be able to come together that way, and um, uh, go beyond their individual languages into this one, spirit language, or the vocables, or I've heard it called different things. What those songs are, and the power of them.
Yeah, it's I remember when I was up in Standing Rock, when the elder was saying, our language is a gift from the Creator,
Mm.
and and I know the Mazatec Indians, they referred to the mushroom as, I forget the word, but translates to flesh of God, and I always thought that was kind of
To what?
interesting.
I missed.
Flesh of God.
Oh, the flesh of the gods. Yeah, yeah.
So it was kind of like this kind of indigenous wisdom that you know perhaps our brain's capacity for language came from eating these plants and these medicines that that
Yeah.
helped to evolve these language regions in the brain, as we were following the whole kind of the stone ape theory, as we're following these bison and herd animals, and these mushrooms are growing in the feces, and that type of stuff.
Yeah.
um but that's a pet theory, but and it's hard to, you can't form a, you can't do an experiment to prove that or disprove
No,
that.
but I was one more thing about the peyote that I- it was in the 1970s. Some chemists discovered that uh, I that peyote has a antibiotic quality to it that's effective against staph infection. And I thought this was, really interesting because I definitely have seen um, peyote in peyote ceremonies. People come in sick, like, with cold, flu, that kind of sickness, or, not feeling well, not necessarily a disease, but just feeling sick, and thinking, the last thing this person needs to do is sit up all night, and not sleep and not rest. And yet they often end up healed by the morning. And so when I discovered this about, the antibiotic quality of peyote, and thinking back to Quanah Parker, I don't know if much about Quanah Parker. Well, he was one of the originators of the Native American Church, and he was the last chief to actually, give up, and he was a you know his mother was a captive. She was a white woman captive, and his sister, she married the chief. She had Quanah Parker. He became the chief. It's a great story, the story of Quanah Parker, and he's such an amazing man. But he apparently had been gored by a bull and was dying from an infection, and they brought a curandera up from Mexico, who must have been a Huicho or a Cora or a Tarahumara. I'm not sure, who, but obviously a peyote using, curandera. She used the peyote on him and healed him, and both internally and topically, and it was from that experience that he went on to create the half moon altar and the that wing of the Native American Church.
Oh yeah, that's, as you were telling that story, it was kind of like clicking in my head, like, oh yeah, yeah, yeah. I remember this, the name. Are there any other kind of cacti that are really endangered, or is peyote the main one that's?
I think peyote, is the main one. San Pedro, grows so easily, and it's legal as a decorative cactus. So you see it every, in people's yards, and a lot of people, grow it, and it's all over Mexico. I mean, it's all over everywhere. And of course, in South America, there's, San Pedro ceremonies. It has quite a bit less mescaline in it than peyote does. And I think energetically, they're very different. Peyote is very alert, mentally alert. It has, I think, about 60 some other active alkaloids in it besides the mescaline. And the San Pedro is more feminine. The peyote is more masculine in terms of this kind of alert, energetic quality to it, and it's very lucid and clear, and can be, very colorful as well. And the San Pedro is more softer, dreamier. It's almost like a yin and a yang or something, at least in my experience.
A little bit more dissociative, like you said, more alert, which
Mm,
Peyote's a little bit more alert. San Pedro a
I
little
think,
more dreamier, kind of.
yeah, peyote really fits uh, into the collective ceremony of, having a group of people, whether, NAC is very structured, um, but if you're with the Weechels, it's not like that at all. The Weechels are very playful in the way that their ceremony is done, and the babe children and the mothers lay around the fire, and everybody, the children drink the peyote, and there's music and there's dancing. There's a particular dance that happens in the middle of the night where the grandmothers get you up, and you do this dance, the deer dance around the fire, and it's very, very beautiful. The Weechels really taught me about the essentialness of the sacred and the profane in a ceremony, of like that it doesn't have to all be very serious, that laughter is an important part of the ceremony, because they're so non-Christian. They don't have those kind of uh, ideas about church. We're in church now, and
Yeah, recreation is a big part of spirituality. This
yeah.
ability to fun and to kind
Oh, I'm losing you. Oh,
of. Oh, sorry. My
your pods.
yeah, my
War-
AirPod died. Is me?
turn your volume up a little bit if you can.
Okay.
Yeah.
It's better.
Yeah. So I think the San Pedro, for the San Pedro ceremony, where part of that, the ceremony there requires you or allows you to be more in that dream space. So you're not being asked to be in the collective awareness of, a whole group of people. Yeah. So I think they're both wonderful, and but the San Pedro does not necessarily work in the peyote ceremony.
I get you.
Yeah.
I have a really off the wall question to ask you, because you've been in this region of the world, and I've reading about different psychedelic plants. This one's caught my eye, and it's called Piule, Piule. I'm just curious if you've ever come across it in any of your traveling, or do you even know what I'm talking about? If you don't know
No,
what I'm talking about.
I haven't heard that one. Is it? Do you know?
Okay.
Are
It,
there any names for it?
it looks like a bean. It's like this red bean. It looks like a red black-eyed pea almost.
Oh, uh-huh.
And I read that, Maria Sabina would incorporate those into her mushroom ceremonies. That it because mushrooms are only available like 2 weeks out of the year. So they got to use the other psychedelic plants that they have
Right. Yeah.
available. And because the bean is red, and the black-eyed part of it looks like a bleeding eye.
Uh,
And that's like a vision. That
uh,
type of thing. And
I
I
have.
keep like trying to find seeds to order it to grow at my backyard, because no one's going to know what it is, but I just can't ever find them. And I was just wondering, since you've been in that region, but I guess not.
I've never heard of that. Although I know in the early days of the conquistadors and the Spanish discovering the peyote use, they they one, they called it a mezcal. I think they talked about like a bean, mezcal bean or something like that. Um,
Yeah.
but then they discovered it was actually a cactus. But I know that the Mazatecs, I mean, they have Salvia divinorum, they use the tobacco, they have a variety of mushrooms, they have a number of different things, but I've not heard of this. I'll find out.
Yeah.
I'll ask around about it though.
All
Yeah.
right. If you could, please. Because my first, I guess, back, remember that CIA, MK Ultra days, right? And, they were out there looking for all these different, types of drugs for mind control. They had sent an agent to Central America for the peel. And when it was there, he found out about the mushrooms. And he comes back with this big bag of peel. And then he told him about the mushrooms. And then that got the whole Gordon Wasson, kind of endeavor, kind of going, with the life and everything. But I've
And you
just always, huh?
PIULE?
Yeah,
Interesting. Yeah.
yeah. It's a really beautiful, if you, Google the image and look at it, it's a really beautiful being.
Uh,
And they make, sometimes you see them, they make like decorative, like jewelry out of it,
yeah, I know.
too.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Huh. Do you know anybody who has ever had an experience with it?
No, that's I've heard it's psychedelic, but I've never heard like from someone that said, "Oh yeah, I've tried this." So I thought, being as well traveled as you are, maybe you've come
Uh-huh.
across it or something. But
No.
I got to keep asking, I
Yeah.
guess.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, the Americas are the new world is so interesting, and Mexico in particular, is so fascinating, because it has the peyote, it was the source of the mushrooms, and then the toad, the 5-MeO, the toad, Salvia divinorum, and of course further south, in South America, the ayahuasca, Banisteriopsis caapi, and psychotria, and numerous other things. But Mexico is, you know, I that was one of the reasons that we did that initial giveaway, was just a way to like honor Mexico for what it's given us, and
Yeah.
with the Miyarika Institute.
What about the toad and the toad venom? Is that something that's kind of at risk right now because of this new interest?
It is. It absolutely is. There's a yes. I'm sorry to say I've heard horrible stories of what's been going on there. With cat. I don't even want to go into it. But yes, absolutely. And and I think that area is an area where there's a lot of reckless, bad actors administering that, and I've come across, too many people who have been, um, kind of discombobulated for 6 months to a year out of their life, after, uh, a bad setting, a way too large of a dose of the toad, and it's a very powerful, beautiful experience when done correctly, but there's unfortunately, I feel like there has been a lot of you know uh, bad actors in that field, and recklessness, in terms of administering it to people not in good settings and safe environments.
So as we wrap up, I want to kind of get your thoughts on, how are we going to address this issue of bridging, that there's a cultural mistrust, I guess, amongst, indigenous people with white people, and, the white European model, being burned over centuries of time.
Mm.
How do you see, integrating this, wisdom and healing that, has been part of the indigenous culture, in helping to bridge that gap so that, we can integrate, Western medicine with some indigenous thought, and to kind of help to kind of bridge that divide. So as the psychedelic research moves forward, that it's, best practices, best
Mm.
informed, what's, they know, they understand it in and out, how it works. How's that going to, how do you foresee that transitioning happening?
Wow. Well, I hope that this, what we're seeing right now around Black Lives Matter, that um, that the Native American reality gets brought into that, because I feel like, um, you know, long before the slaves were brought here, the Native Americans have been, put under, they also have been enslaved in terms of of our culture. And the I think that Wounded Knee was a real tragedy. I think that what happened around the ghost dance um, was a huge cultural, scar trauma. You were talking about, epigenetic, trauma being passed down. I think the taking of the children and putting them into schools and having them lose their language. But I think that the Native American church has been such a, um, like I said, a unifying thing, and especially because so many of those those children who were taken, they were taken out of their their culture, their tribe, whether they were Navajo or Hopi or Lakota or Crow or Cheyenne or Arapaho, um, which meant that they didn't get to go through their initiations. They didn't get to become the dancer or the drummer or the who, in the Kiva societies, or whatever their lineage would have been, whatever their lineage actually was, that got broken. And um, and Native American church, I feel like, really has, um, it 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 gave it gave them a way to, um, you know, reclaim themselves and be able to sit together and have that spirit language, of the songs. And um, I I knew Wallace Black Elk and his wife Grace Spotted Eagle, and um, and Grace told me that her father was in a peyote meeting in around 1920 in Colorado, and federal agents came in and broke up the meeting. And if you think about 1920, that's like less than 30 years after Wounded Knee, okay? And the government was still edgy around Indians getting together, because the ghost dance was such a revitalization movement, that swept through the uh, through America. And um, and on the back of that, really around that same time period, was when the the peyote ceremony, came into being. And so anyway, she said that federal agents came in and broke up the meeting and told them that they had to take the pipe. They were using the pipe in the meeting, um, and they had to take the pipe out of the ceremony if they wanted to continue to do it, and they needed to bring the Bible into it. and um, and she described it. She said, they were told, you have to put the pipe behind you, um, and and I think that's when maybe the roll up, in the middle of the ceremony, there's a corn husk and tobacco, and you kind of roll up, a big cigarette, and you do a prayer smoke, in the meeting, and I I I suspect, what Grace was saying was that, in the early days, I know in the early days, there also was dancing, similar probably to like the deer dance or what the Weechels did. So the dancing stopped, that would have been too close to the ghost dance, to dancing. And then, the pipe now is been converted to a cigarette, and the the Bible brought in a sense that often the prayers are to, like, Holy Father God, as opposed to like Great Spirit, and and I know some of the meetings that I was in decades ago, some of the road chiefs would even, make kind of jokes, like, about, okay, we're going to just like open up our hymn book, and yeah, because there's certain songs that are sung, in the early part of the evening and after midnight and in the morning, so yeah. So I think there's, and back to your question, what do we do? All I can think of is that I hope these protests and this awakening that's happening in white culture around our racism, our inherent racism, even when we don't feel like we are, but just it's just so ingrained, but I think that so many people all around the world are realizing, wait, this is just madness. So I hope that spills over in our relationship to Native Americans, and somehow we can really make amends and ask forgiveness and find a new way to operate and relieve some of the poverty and the inequality, that happens around Native women, and what is going on there, and in Canada,
Yeah.
and disappearing, and there's a lot of healing to happen.
Yeah, you bring up a good point. My, you know, some shameless self-plugging. My dissertation was on forgiveness. And
Ah,
there needs to be, that reconciliation, I guess.
mm,
Just like with like you said, the Black Lives Movement, with the indigenous cultures of, you know, addressing the past trauma, how do we move forward? And, just acknowledging that, that the American Indian culture has something to teach in regards to these medicines,
yeah.
a lot to teach. And, how do we, and as I'm a professional looking at these different programs, I'm always kind of relieved when I see, that there's some kind of native influence being brought into the training of these professionals, that,
Mm,
they're seeking out the healers from different tribes to try to help to kind of, you know, make this a multicultural
mm,
experience.
yeah.
You
And I think too, like even in the psychedelic therapy world, it's like, um, uh, they make a nice room, and they might have a Buddha, and there's like, flowers, and it's it's a nice aesthetic environment, and but I think also that if there's any way that we can introduce very simple, elegant, ceremonial forms into the process of the therapy. It just, we're so hungry for that kind of thing, as a as a people, and it awakens something in people, and it helps connect them to nature and to the natural world, and and then we think about climate change, and we think about pipelines, and all of these various things that are so connected. So um, it's really it's an important part of it. Not to be embarrassed by our own inherent spirituality.
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Right. Good. Well, I want to thank you so much for your time.
Yeah.
All night, but I won't. You got other things to do. I'm glad you're doing well. Thank you for making time for us. I know you had a little medical emergency.
I know. Yeah.
Thank you for making time for us all the way in Colorado.
Yeah. Thank you. It was fun talking with you, and
hold on one sec.
Yeah.
Oh, no, let me try.
Yeah.
Okay, there I am.
Yeah.
I got a little bit of juice back, so we'll wrap up while I got juice.
Okay.
And again, let me know if you need some data analyzed. I'm really interested in all this research that you ran, so hit me up. You got my email.
Okay, good. Yeah, thanks.
And thank you so much again.
Okay, thank you. Thank Andrew too. I don't know what he was doing in the background there. It all happened or something.
Thank you. He's like he helps with there were a couple questions that came up that I tried to address as we were going on. So I hope we got to those.
Okay,
thank you, Andrew, for emceeing and filtering the questions to my attention. And you have a good night, Adele.
Okay, you too. Good night.
All right.
Bless.
Bye.
Bye.